I think it's useful to have a model with two extremes, two polar extremes. One would be a country where all the property was in the land or in the physical assets or in the companies within the country. And the other extreme would be a country where substantially all the property, let's say 95%, was in cyberspace, stored in the heads of the people, let's say in the form of Bitcoin in cyberspace. So in the one extreme, where all the property is in the land, there's an encouragement to war because the country right next to you can invade your borders and take all the property, right? Especially if the property is something which can't be destroyed, like gold. Let's say the most extreme, we've got all of our money in gold in a vault, indestructible, and you live next door. You can come in the country, kill everybody, firebomb everything, take the gold, leave, right? So gold is an encouragement to violence from outside, encouragement to war. If the property is buildings and factories and farms, maybe I want to use a neutron bomb, right? Like I want to use something which doesn't necessarily destroy the structures. You have to be a little bit more careful and surgical in your war, right? Not to destroy something. We know that war is encouraged by immobile property or indestructible property in the physical realm. And the encouragement to corruption, I'll call politics, right? If I want to seize your property via politics, the way I do it is you have a building, I see the building, I tax the building 2% a year. I reassess the value of the building up 7% a year. And in about 20 years, I've taken your building, right? So taxation is a way for me to seize your property. Expropriation is a quicker way. I just seize your oil company or I just seize your land. We need your land for an airport. We need your land for a school. We're going to pay you whatever we're going to pay you, right? So when the property is immobile, there's a tendency for a foreign politician or a foreign government to cross your border with violence and take it all. And if they do cross your border with violence, they get it all, depending upon how indestructible it is, right? And how surgical they are. And then when your property is immobile, there's a tendency for the authority of the federal government or the provincial government simply to tax it or expropriate it. Or I can get it by regulating it, right? I can just say that, oh, you operate a bakery and it is now illegal to bake bread. That happened in New York. The governor of New York made it illegal to bake bread. So your bakery is worthless. I can make it illegal to make hats. They did that too. The Hat Act. It's illegal to make hats. I can make it, you have a ranch and you export beef. I make it illegal to export beef. I make it illegal to sell, right? And then if I can't make it legal, I can put a price control on it. It's illegal to sell it for more than $1. It costs you $2. I bankrupt you. Then I buy your factory or your ranch out of receivership, and then I change that law and I make it illegal, but not for the government or not for a person with a license, and then it's legal again. So in that environment, you have a high return on corruption and you have a high return on violence and war. In the other extreme, all the property is digital, so the hostile nation state crosses the border and kills everybody, and there's no property left. There's nothing to seize because the property's gone, because it was in cyberspace. Humans have had courage for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. The history books are full of examples of people that died for their beliefs. You read Livy, the Romans attack a city. The people in the city didn't want to give in to the Romans. They got so angry, they took all of their goods, they piled them in a bonfire, they burned everything, they even burned all their jewelry down, and then they threw themselves in the bonfire. If you read the sack of Carthage, the famous example in Carthage is the prince of Carthage was going to surrender to the Romans, and his wife went up to the roof of the citadel with the children, and she said, "You're not a Carthaginian, you're no husband of mine anymore." And she threw herself and her kids off the top of the building before they would surrender to the Romans, right? And so there's plenty of examples of people dying for their beliefs, but the problem is the property was seized anyway. And that makes me believe that, in fact, when your property is in your head, when they invade your country and they put you in a jail cell and they sweat you for 90 days, they're not going to get more than half, right? You know, you might get half. I'll do a deal with you. I'll give you 25%. I'll give you 50%. 50% turns out to be like the tax rate that's stable. Like when the government gets strong enough that they're going to take as much money as they can, they generally take like 50% of everything, and they kind of can get away with taking half. But when you get to the point where you're taking 90% of everything, people just think, I'm just not going to work anymore. I'm leaving if I can get out. And I'm not, this is not worth the trouble, right? And the famous example in the Beatles song is it's 19 parts for you and 1 for me, because the tax rate in Britain was 95% at one point. So I think on the right side of the axis, when all property is substantially Bitcoin and digital, then there's no point in invading that country because you're not getting anything. But because, first of all, if you did invade the country, unless you did it in an hour or less and no one knew, all the Bitcoin will be gone from the country, right? It's going to be wired off into cyberspace, put into some time lock multi-sig, or it's going to another country. The Bitcoin can move faster than the army can move. So it's not really that productive to engage in war to get it. And then the corruption doesn't make a lot of sense, because if I run a country A, and I pass a law taxing Bitcoin 5% a year or 50%, the Bitcoin leaves the country, right? And Bitcoin is mobile property in the cyber domain. The example of this in the real domain is, there was an island in the Mediterranean that I won't name that came up with the idea of taxing yachts. It had a bunch of super yachts there. And they decided that all these super yacht owners had a lot of money and it was unfair that they should be there, even though the yachts are spending millions of dollars a year on dockage and buying food and buying drink and paying for services. But their thought was, we just want more. It's not enough. So they passed a law taxing the super yachts, thinking that they were such a great place. And all the yachts were in the port until the day before the law went in. And then the day the law went into action, the entire port was empty and the yachts never came back. Yep. And the entire economy crashed. All the shop owners, all were going bankrupt. They went back to the politicians and said, that was a pretty stupid law. Can we reverse that one? And they reversed that. And then the yachts came back. Yachts are mobile property, right? But of course, Bitcoin is a lot better than a yacht. If you're going to store your value for 100 years, I recommend the Bitcoin, not the yacht. But I would say, when you have a building and it's in the middle of town and you're the richest person in town, everybody walks by the building and they think it's really unfair that rich person doesn't pay more taxes. And they just start thinking about a way to put a progressive tax on that building. And the problem with that, coming back to corruption, is if you actually are a rich person with a building in the middle of town and they haven't stolen all your money, it's because you're the one backing the politicians. And so you're basically encouraging the corruption of the political process, because to have wealth that is visible and stationary, it requires that you elect the politicians so that they don't steal your wealth. And you have two classes of people. Those that don't engage in politics with stationary, visible wealth, and their wealth is stolen within one generation. They are all impoverished. And then you have people that have visible, stationary wealth that do engage in politics, that contribute to the political process, that corrupt the political process. They get to keep their wealth. But in so doing, they corrupt themselves. And once they realize that they can influence a politician to not steal their wealth, they basically influence the politician to steal some competitor's wealth. And you engage in this never-ending cycle of political corruption where we weaponize the political system, because you just can't have wealth in a virtuous fashion that is visible and stationary in a political jurisdiction, because all the political systems all tend toward power and they all tend toward corruption. And so in the absence of freedom to leave and take your property with you, This system is doomed to an endless cycle of ever greater corruption until eventually it reaches this entropic frontier where it collapses under its own weight.